Welcome to Office Centurion. I'll be your guide. So today I'd like to talk about a debate that I heard a few weeks ago. It's between Bart Ehrman and some terrible apologist. I think his name is Bass. You know, if I wasn't strong in my faith, the arguments that Bass made, not the defenses or the objections that Bart Ehrman had, but the argument that Bass gave would probably get me toward, if not atheism, at least agnosticism. Let's talk about why I believe in Jesus, and let's talk about why I believe that Christianity is true. So I was talking about this debate that Bart Ehrman had against Justin Bass, and it was not a good debate for the Christian side. But I believe in Jesus, and I am a Christian. So how did I get there? Now, I'm not going to talk about why I believe in God, because that's a completely different equation. You can believe in God without believing in Christianity. Or you can believe in a God, I should say, without believing in Christianity. Why do I believe that Christianity is true? So let's talk about that. So, first off, let me give you a short background. When I first read the Bible, I did what everybody does. I didn't believe it. People living for 200, 500 years. It was just unbelievable. Giants, in at least one translation of the Bible, unicorns and dragons. You can't get there, right? So, what do you do? Well, I decided to read everything else. Based on my uncle's advice, I read all the Mesopotamian stuff. I read all the Greek stuff. I read a fair amount of Eastern, Japanese Taoism, and a lot of Hinduism. And I have most of those books back there, if you can't see them. And I read through it, and I loved all that stuff. And eventually I got around to reading. I bought 3 books. I got the Bible, I got the Quran, and I got the Book of Mormon. And I was going to, do exactly what I'd been doing, just read through them. But when I read through the Bible the first time, and I didn't finish it, and when I found it unbelievable, I think Numbers or maybe Deuteronomy, one of the books that pretty much ends everyone's plan to finish the Bible. Yeah, that the begots and the how many lampstands, like it's just, yeah, exactly where everybody else ends. That's where I ended the first time I read it. And until that point, what I knew about the Bible outside of what I heard in church was what TV told me, what celebrities told me, Madonna, Bill Maher, George Carlin, Janine Garofalo. So I didn't take it too seriously, and I trusted the celebrity voices I was hearing and the media voices and the popular culture that I was hearing. The funny thing, though, is that when I finally did read it, what they said was in there was not in there. And what they said wasn't in there was in there. So I realized they didn't know what they were talking about. So after this journey of wanting to find out what actual religions actually said about themselves, and I get back around to the Bible and I read it all the way through, I came to the realization that Christianity is true. Well, how do you get there, right? Because believing in God is one thing. Reading all these other books, none of those books, like, yes, I do believe that there was a Trojan War. Do I believe that Odysseus and Achilles did the things that are in the Iliad and the Odyssey? No. Do I believe it's possible that an Achilles or an Odysseus really existed? Yes, I believe it's possible 2 men with those names existed in that time. Not probable, but possible. Or that the myths that surround that name come from different characters that really did exist? Sure. Could those original characters with maybe different names be a compilation of different people who did things? Sure. In fact, if you read ancient Greek texts, you'll see that a lot of the ancient commentary, the idea was that these were ancient kings, these great ancient heroes, these gods were kings. Okay, so that idea of secularizing, or at least bringing down to earth where the myths come from, that's an old idea. That's an old, ancient idea, long before the Enlightenment. So when you read the Bible for the first time, after having read all of this stuff, after having read a bunch of Greek history, everything from Herodotus all the way to Julius Caesar's Civil War, and having read all this mythology and all this ancient religion, everything from the Emma Elish and the Atarhasis all the way to the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita and other books like that, the Upanishads. You have an idea of what religion sounds like. You have an idea of what history sounds like. And you see where they intermix and they touch each other and how they influence each other. And so you get to the Bible, and the first time you read it and you take it seriously and you're able to get through it, you're doing a lot of the same justifications. Okay, so maybe he wasn't really a giant. He was just a tall person. So maybe the seas parted because of natural things, or maybe it wasn't that sea. Maybe it was a different sea, like the Reed Sea, something smaller, something that the waters could actually part. And maybe there's a tradition or a natural occurrence that every so many years you actually can see this happening over and over again. Okay, and so there's exaggeration and all these hyperboles, and okay, so you get through all of that and you do your justifications and you do your reconciling and you get through the Old Testament. But I'm telling you that Christianity is true, not that Judaism is true. Okay, so why would an educated person who's come to the Bible as an adult decide that Christianity is true and it's the one true religion and that Jesus is God? Those are a lot of leaps. So let's start off with where I started off. I am 33 years old at this time when I'm reading the Bible for the first time as an adult. I've tried the book. I've tried the Good News Bible. I've tried the King James and the New King James. Didn't do it for me. It ended up being the NAB was the first Bible that really caught my attention, the first translation that I found acceptable. Yes, I'm Catholic, but at the time I was not going to church. I wasn't participating in church life. The last time I had gone to church, I was like 15. First, let's start off with Jesus. Jesus isn't the name of Jesus. It's Yeshua or Joshua. So Joshua is a very popular name at Jewish times, in the Jewish culture at that time. So is it possible that someone named Joshua was a preacher and was the son of a carpenter and was crucified by the Romans for preaching? So you look at history at that time and you say, not only is it possible, not only is it probable, but there were many people named Joshua. It's a very common name. And some of them were indeed preachers, street preachers. And some of them did indeed get crucified. So already right there, we have a Jesus. There were apocalyptic street preachers in Judea at that time. And yes, if they would have been speaking about a kingdom where they were the king, or even if his believers were professing that, the Romans would have crucified that person for that. Because A, Romans hate kings, and B, any challenge to political power was crushed by the Romans in brutal ways. So yes, crucifixions happened. Yes, there were street preachers and apocalyptic preachers in Judea at that time. Yes, there were rabbis who were beginning what people would call cults or sects, and there were competing sects of rabbinical Judaism happening at the exact same time. So all of that is not only possible, but it's historical fact. And yeah, there were people named Joshua who were doing this. It used to be a popular name. Jesus is just a translation of that name into Greek. Christ is just a translation of the word Messiah. And there were other Messiahs. There were biblical and historical Messiahs in history. So, all of that fits real history. So the mythicists are thrown right out the window, right out the way. But it's still a very far leap to get from it is more than just possible, but likely that there was a man named Jesus who was an apocalyptic preacher, who was crucified for preaching a new kingdom where he was the king, or at least where his followers were saying that. There's a big leap from that to Jesus was resurrected and Jesus is God. What's the next step? Well, I read the Bible all the way through. So reading the history stuff, the stuff outside of the Bible, the extra biblical material, gets me to, Jesus, there was a Jesus. Okay, now the Jesus in the Bible, is that the same Jesus who was crucified? Okay, so the Jesus in the Bible, yes, the writers are using literary tricks. Yes, the writers know the Old Testament very well, and they specifically know the Septuagint version, not necessarily the Hebrew version, because the Hebrew version translates differently. But the Septuagint version, the Greek version, which translates into the Koine Greek, which is what Jesus was using. Jesus would have read, and so people who would like to say that he's illiterate, no, that's not even possible. He was a Jewish rabbi. He has to know Hebrew. He's illiterate in the same way that and I'm Hispanic, so I'm going to use Spanish here, that someone from a Spanish culture coming into America or Canada and having to read English is illiterate, or going to the UK is illiterate. They're illiterate in the national language. The common language is going to be Greek. The language of the upper crust, of the elite, is going to be Latin. Later that change, in the common language, the vulgar language will then become Latin. That's way later on. That's why it'll be called the Vulgate for a specific Bible. But the Septuagint is in Greek, and Jesus speaks Aramaic. So we know that Jesus can read at least one language, which is Hebrew. He may be able to read two languages. Whenever Jesus speaks, he speaks in Aramaic. Okay? So we know that Jesus speaks Aramaic, and we know that as a rabbi, he would have to know the Old Testament. And this is not something that's like a little bit, like he kind of had to know some verses. No. To be a rabbi, he had to specifically go through a very long process of memorization of the Hebrew, including reading and writing. So, not an illiterate street preacher. An apocalyptic preacher, not necessarily illiterate. But we don't know that he could actually read and speak Greek. Or do we? Because what he says in Aramaic matches the Septuagint version of the Bible. So he either heard or understood or read Greek. So we have Aramaic and Greek. Does that mean he was able to speak Latin, considering he was able to speak to Pontius Pilate? Or does that mean that Pontius Pilate could either speak Hebrew or Aramaic, or if neither, that he had a translator around to speak to Jesus? We don't know. But these literary tricks that they're doing in the Bible when they're telling Jesus' story, they're based on something called the sayings of Jesus, that most historians agree was probably the real sayings of a real man. Now, there's some speculation there. And what Bass did that I don't like is that he used not speculative writing, but he used disputed writing. Writing that either the dates are disputed for them to be accurate, or the authorship is disputed, or even the information in them are disputed to prove a disputed fact. You can't use a disputed thing to prove a disputed event. That doesn't work. Because now you have, if the disputed thing goes away, then your other disputed question goes away as well. You don't have anything concrete there. But I'm saying there is something concrete. I'm saying I do believe. Joshua of Nazareth. Joshua of Bethlehem. Who's this guy? The Bible uses the sayings of Jesus, which are most likely real sayings. So the words of Jesus in the Bible, the red letters, the ones that match up in all four Gospels, are likely the real sayings of the real man. So we can learn a little bit about his theology and a little bit of how he thought and what he was referencing and what he was saying. What he is doing in the text with these words is interesting because it thematically reaches back to different books in the Bible. And what the writer, the inspired writer, or the human writer, whatever you want to call him, what he's doing is he's putting all of that together with different references, and he's presenting an argument. So, like I said, I read the Bible all the way through. When I read it all the way through, and you get to Jesus on the Mount, and he's saying the Beatitudes, there is no doubt that he has to be killed, that he will be killed. Not in a kind of salvific, messianic way that we think of now, but looking at it from a Jewish point of view. So history showed me that yes, reading real history, that someone named Joshua of Nazareth, who was preaching about a new kingdom, and his believers believed that he was a king, would be crucified by the Romans. But reading the Bible, reading the Old Testament, taught me that if someone was preaching what Jesus was preaching in the sayings of Jesus, which most secular biblical scholars agree is probably what the real Jesus said, that if these things were said according to Jewish law, he would have to be put to death because he was violating Jewish religious laws. I am. Me and the Father are one. You can't get a divorce. Moses didn't give you the full law because of how hard your hearts were. He's saying he's higher than the highest prophets of Judaism. He's saying that before they were, he is. These are hugely controversial statements, and the only remedy for them is death, is blood. And the Bible in the Old Testament, whether it's Isaiah or Psalms or wherever you want to go, where there's a crucifixion being described, tells you exactly how it would look. So, let's say you're still a secularist, but you can't be a mythicist anymore. And you say, okay, so either the writers change the events to match what happened in the past, to match what was said in the Bible, or while they were seeing the events happen, it made them think of what happens in the Old Testament. Because following a rabbi, they would have also had to have studied the Old Testament. So studying the Torah, they would have known these verses very well. And then, just as they're supposed to, they would have then added this interpretation to it, this interpretive lens of what happened to Jesus and how it relates to what is said in the Torah. You have literary devices, you have typology then emerge. And you have typology that Jesus himself explains. So the writer, you could say, maybe felt that he was licensed to add in this typology. And then, was it a single writer or was it a group of writers? Was it oral tradition first and then written down? All that's secondary. What we know is that if this real Jesus really did say these things, that both under Roman law and under Hebrew law, he would have to be crucified. Well, he would have to be put to death. And in the Roman Empire, that meant crucifixion for those who were insurrectionists. Now, a literalist or a mythicist might come back here and then say, well, wait a minute. They said hung on a tree. He was crucified. Yes. the tree of life, the cross, the metaphor for that is tree. And the cross, more than just being a metaphor, the metaphor for it being a tree, but you're talking about the New Testament being a deeply Hebrew book, a deeply Jewish book. And so when it talks about Rome, it talks about Babylon, it's talking about everything in Jewish terms. And by putting the cross in Jewish terms, well, the lowest thing that can happen to someone in Judaism is to be hung on a tree. So Jesus is hung on a tree because it's the lowest insult. It's the greatest insult. It's as low as you can go. So that way he can then even go lower. He can go into Sheol, what we call hell. So what have we learned? We've learned that according to actual history, the name Joshua was very common. We've learned that it was a real thing that apocalyptic preachers were around and were crucified during that time. We've learned that under Jewish law, for the things that Jesus had said, he would have been put to death, and that under Roman law, for the things that Jesus' followers said, he would have been crucified. All of that leads up to historical probability. Not improbability, probability. Jesus, the man, is not only possible, he's probable and likely. Most secular scholars agree that the words of Jesus, as presented in the Synoptic Gospels, are likely to be accurate, things that a real man really did say, that these words would have led to this man's death, both under Hebrew law and to crucifixion under Roman law. So we know that all the events leading up to the crucifixion are accurate. We'll talk about Mary and some other aspects in a second. So we know that all of that is accurate, and that the metaphors that some mythicists like to throw out, and the hyperbole that the Bible uses, is consistent with the literary tradition of Jewish people. So the hyperbole is not out of context. The analogies are not something that a later generation added back into it, and the typology is present both in Jesus' words and that the writers of these Gospels, whether they're individual or a group, whether they were writing at that exact time period or a little bit later, are consistent with the time period they were writing in and with the literary styles that existed. You can see this by reading other writings from that time period. So, all of this matches with literal history. What about the actual moment of death? How do we know that it wasn't a great swoon? How do we know that Jesus didn't have any brothers or sisters if the Bible itself uses the words brothers and sisters? Well, first off, there's a little trick there in the language, which is the same word for cousins is the same word for brothers and sisters. But that's not enough. See, Jesus has his favorite disciple adopt his mother. That is only done if there is not any directly blood-related brothers and sisters. So that means that either the brothers and sisters were from Joseph, or adopted, or were cousins. So now we have the virgin birth, at least as it would be understood in ancient times. Okay, virgin birth. Wait, how do we get there from wasn't there a leap? No, there wasn't a leap. Because of the typology that Jesus uses, and the typology that is present in the Bible. Because Mary is going to be represented as the church, as the first believer, as the first Christian. And the church is being represented typologically with the ark. Both the Ark of the Covenant and Noah's Ark. And she's going to be contrasted with Eve. Now, We're not getting theology yet. We're still in typology. We're still talking history. So the language that would be used for Mary as the Virgin Mother is consistent with the typology used at that time. Okay, so we got consistency historically, we got consistency theologically, we got consistency with reality. How do we know that he didn't swoon? Well, Joe Heschmeyer did a really great video talking about that. I'll try to link it below. But basically, scientifically, medically, the way Jesus is described as dying in the Bible is consistent with actual medical science and with historical evidence. So, the death is accurate to history. So, now what about the Peter Parker problem? You might be asking, what's the Peter Parker problem? Peter Parker is a kid that lived in New York. I can guarantee you right now you can find someone in New York named Peter Parker. If not someone in New York, at least someone somewhere around the surrounding areas. And when Peter Parker was originally created, before his name was famous, it's probably possible that you can find someone named Peter Parker. So how do we know that George Washington existed and Abraham Lincoln existed, but Peter Parker is not a real person? So there's this really terrible Protestant argument called, and it's two things. It's the problem of the unexpected. So that's something that Bass uses. And the other one is the problem of embarrassment. And the idea is that if something's embarrassing, it must be true. And if something is unbelievable, it must be true, because why else would you put it in there? Neither of those arguments work. So just throw them away. The reason why we don't have the Peter Parker problem is because genre and authorial intent. See, when reading a history, we know that the story is meant to be history. When reading a fiction or a comic book or watching a fictional movie, we know the intent is fiction. It is the intent of the author and the understanding of the audience at that time that helps us judge and gauge whether the material we are reading was meant to be taken literally as real history or as simply a story or myth. And now the mythicist here is kind of clear cut, right? And so this is where the idea of embarrassment comes in. But it's a king who's crucified. Who would think that's true? The idea that no one could make up this story is false. Anybody can make up anything. So you have to make a connection here. Can you follow, if you follow the rules that Jesus laid out, are these true rules? This is the moral argument. It's true because the morality in it is true. It's true because the logic in it holds. The ethics are correct. So if you live out a Christian life, if you turn the other cheek, if you love your enemy, love your neighbor, love yourself, and love God above all, you will have a great life. All of these things end up being true. So the morality works. The theology works. So it's functional. So it's true in a practical sense. We haven't got into a literal sense yet. So historically it's probable. Theologically, it's functional. Ethically, it's functional, and it does change the world. But you can't look for the results to prove that the initial action is true. Okay, so are we at an impasse yet? Have we reached the point where Bart can't be reached? No. Bass's arguments were inane. Here's the next step. And Jesus' mother being Mary makes sense. Jesus' mother being referred to as a virgin makes sense. Christians existed after this time period. So we know that going forward, Christianity is a thing that really does exist in history, and it's not based on other religions, though it might have been influenced by other religions. So we don't have to deny influence. We don't have to deny Judaism as being the seed of Christianity. We don't have to deny any of that. So we got theological basis, we got historical basis to believe everything up to the crucifixion. Now, what about the resurrection? This part does take faith. Faith here not meaning believing in something you don't have evidence for. That's not what I mean by faith. I'm talking about trust. You have to trust the authority. Who are the authorities here? Peter and Paul. You have to trust that those writers are real. You have to trust the undisputed letters, not the Gospels, because the Gospels come later. The letters, the undisputed letters. You have to trust that what the writers are saying is true. We can argue that they believe that it's true. And we can argue that what they say matches what history shows. Again, these are the undisputed letters, not the disputed ones. And we can also argue that the later Gospels are going to reflect what is shown in the letters, in the epistles. So why do you trust? Why trust the letters? That is faith. That's where the leap of faith comes in. Either you trust the letters or you don't. We can go with the crucifixion. We can do everything up to the crucifixion and say that that's real. So we can throw away the mythicists. We can ignore other religions. Getting to the resurrection takes faith, takes trust in the letters of Paul, in the letters of Peter. What about James? It depends on whether or not you feel that's a disputed letter or not. Once you trust them, if you get there, then you can trust the Gospels, because the Gospels are thematically and literarily consistent with the Old Testament. Trusting the Old Testament is a totally different story here. We're talking about the theology, we're talking about the ethics, we're talking about the morals, and we're talking about the historical event. So, we know that the results show that Christians existed. We know that a man named Jesus is likely. We know that the crucifixion matches with what history shows. And we know that this man named Jesus, if he said the things that he is reported to have said, that he would have been put to death under Jewish law and crucified under Roman law. If the believers who followed him said what they said, this is exactly what would happen. Did the resurrection happen? If it didn't happen, then our faith is for nothing. If it did happen, Jesus is God. Wait, I know. That's another leap, right? Lazarus was resurrected. We don't say that he's God. Elijah is said to have gone up into heaven. We don't say that he's God. Jesus is God. Jesus said, I am. I and the Father are one. The Father and I are one. Okay. If Jesus is not God, and he said those things, then God would not have resurrected him. That is the logical statement here. That is where everything comes together. So if he's truly God, and he says these things, and is resurrected, if he says these things, and he's resurrected, if he says that he's God, and God resurrects him, he's God. There's the connection. Okay. What about Revelations? What about the Old Testament? All of that's something completely different. I'm not trying to prove God in this argument. I am not trying to prove something outside of Christianity. I'm saying that I believe Jesus was real, and I believe Christianity is true. And I know that it existed, and I know that he existed. And I trust the authority. I have faith that Jesus is who he says he is. And that faith comes from believing in the sources that say he was resurrected. The sources are the epistles, not the Gospels, because the Gospels were written later. There you go. That's it. That's your argument. Now, I'm not saying that's going to convince Bart Ehrman. I'm not saying that's going to convince you. But it convinced me. I had already believed in God. Getting to the point where Jesus is God, that's where you get, I explained how I got there. Why I believe in God is a completely different argument. Why didn't I believe any of the other religions that I read? That's a completely different argument. Because I read all those before I read the Bible, and none of them convinced me that they were correct. The closest one was Taoism. Shintoism didn't make me a believer in Shintoism. Buddhism didn't make me a believer in Buddha. Hinduism didn't make me a believer in any of the Hindu gods. Reading Greek mythology didn't make me a believer in any of the Greek gods. Reading history didn't make me a believer in any of the pagan gods. None of that. I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. I'm not a Mormon. I'm not a Muslim. I am a Christian. And if I wasn't a Christian, I'd be a Jew. And if I wasn't Jewish and I wasn't a Christian, I'd be a Taoist. There you go. But yeah, I believe Christianity is true, and I believe Jesus is real, and I believe Jesus is who he claimed to be. And I gave you my reasoning. Peace, like, subscribe.